It came from a dead stretch of space between the Keth cluster and the outer rim of Dominion territory, a region so empty that most star charts labeled it with nothing more than a distance warning and a fuel consumption estimate. No colonies out there, no relay stations, no reason for anyone to be passing through. The signal itself was strange, looping the same tight burst of compressed data every 4 minutes, never changing, never stopping. Like something that had been set to call for help, and then abandoned to do exactly that forever, whether or not anyone was ever going to come. The Vorath Collective picked it up first. Fleet Commander Savrin Das was 3 weeks into a routine patrol when his communications officer flagged the transmission. The Vorath were a careful people, precise and methodical, with a history that stretched back far enough that they had stopped counting their years in simple numbers and had moved to something more like geological epochs. They built their ships the same way they built everything else, which was to say slowly, thoroughly, and with a deep suspicion of anything that had not been tested for at least one full generation. Their vessels were reliable. Their weapons were reliable. Their crews were trained so extensively that individual drills had drills. Savrin listened to the decoded signal twice and then called his senior officers to the bridge. The signal was Galactic Standard, which meant whoever had sent it wanted anyone to understand it. The message was simple. It identified itself as coming from a research vessel called the Pale Morning, registry number and origin not immediately familiar to Savrin's database. It reported a collision with an uncharted object. It reported hull breaches in 3 sections. And then, before the basic distress information, it reported something that made Savrin read the translation twice. Hostile presence on board. Unknown origin. All crew in danger. Do not approach without weapons. Do not approach alone. The Pale Morning had been a galactic cooperative research vessel, a science ship. 18 crew members, maybe 20 if they had brought on extra researchers for whatever they were studying out here. The Galactic Cooperative was a loose collection of 23 species that had come together under a shared charter of exploration and mutual aid, and their research vessels were not warships. They were not even particularly defended. They were meant to go to places where nothing dangerous lived, chart what they found, and come back. Something had gotten on board the Pale Morning, and the crew had been afraid enough to tell whoever came to help that they should not come alone. Savrin pulled up the coordinates attached to the signal. The ship was roughly 8 hours away at standard cruise speed. He spent 6 of those hours running his crew through every weapons drill he knew. When the Pale Morning finally appeared on the long-range sensors, it was immediately obvious that something had gone very wrong. The ship was drifting without any stabilizing thrust, rotating slowly on its long axis like a bottle thrown into the ocean. Several of the running lights along the dorsal spine were dark. One of the secondary sensor arrays had been sheared away at the base, floating alongside the ship at the end of a long tether of wiring. The main engines were cold. Savrin ordered his ship, the Enduring Voice, to come alongside at a distance of 300 meters. He ordered his weapons officer to bring all primary emitters to ready status. He ordered his communications officer to hail the Pale Morning on every frequency they had. Nothing answered. They stayed at 300 meters for 2 hours. Savrin sent 4 more hails. He scanned the Pale Morning with everything the Enduring Voice carried, trying to resolve individual life signs through the hull interference and the slow, sick rotation of the drifting ship. His sensor officer, a meticulous woman named Veth, reported that she could not get a clean read. The hull composition of the Pale Morning was scattering the scans. She thought she detected movement inside, but she could not be certain whether it was organic movement or the settling of damaged systems. Then one of Savrin's secondary officers, a young male named Chorus, pointed to the visual feed from the forward cameras. Something was looking back at them from one of the Pale Morning's viewport windows. It was not any species Savrin recognized. It was large, that much was clear even through the small rectangle of the viewport glass, and it was very still. It seemed to have multiple limbs, though counting them from that angle and distance was difficult. Its coloring, to the extent that Savrin could determine coloring through the low light behind the viewport, was dark, almost completely dark. It stood at the window and it watched the enduring voice for a very long time. Then it moved away from the glass and was gone. Saverin declared a weapons-free state of readiness and called for volunteers to form a boarding team. He got them. He always got them. The Vorth valued courage and his crew was well selected. 12 soldiers in full combat gear, armed with the best the collective made, trained and ready. They crossed the gap in a sealed transfer pod, docked at the pale morning secondary airlock and went inside. They were back 11 minutes later. Or rather, 10 of them were back 11 minutes later. The other 2 never came back at all. The soldiers who returned were not the same as the ones who had left. Saverin had served long enough to recognize the particular blankness that came over experienced fighters when they had seen something that broke their picture of the world. It was not fear, exactly. Fear had an energy to it, a tension in the muscles and a readiness to move. This was something else, something closer to the way a machine looked when it had stopped receiving power. 2 of his soldiers had to be physically supported by their companions. One was making a low, continuous sound that was not quite speech and not quite anything else. The team leader, a veteran officer named Shan who had served with Saverin for 9 years, sat down on the deck of the docking bay and stared at the far wall for 4 minutes without blinking before she could form a coherent report. Whatever was on that ship had killed the crew of the Pale Morning. All of them. In ways that Shan described haltingly and incompletely, because she seemed unable to fully assemble the words for it. And then it had killed 2 of Saverin's people in the same way, quickly and in the dark, before the rest of them had gotten out. Saverin sealed the airlock. He put the enduring voice at maximum weapons readiness. He broadcast a warning on every frequency available, flagged the coordinates in the emergency navigation database, and then he sent a full report to the Vorth Collective Command and to the Galactic Cooperative. The Galactic Cooperative sent 3 ships. None of them came back. The Vorth Collective sent a battle group of 7 vessels, their best, armed with technology developed over centuries of careful, meticulous warfare, crewed by soldiers who had trained longer than most species lived. 2 of those ships were destroyed. 3 were badly damaged. 1 escaped with casualties. The 7th, which had held back to observe, retreated with its captain reporting that she had watched the entity move across the hull of the Pale Morning without any apparent life support equipment, in open vacuum, and tear through the armor plating of a Vorth frigate with its limbs alone. The news of the Vorth battle group's defeat reached the Galactic Council in stages, which made it worse. First came the report from the ship that held back. Then came the damage assessments from the vessels that had survived. Then came the silence from the ones that had not, and silence, in those frequencies, meant what it always meant. 3 other species in the cooperative had independently decided to send vessels without waiting for council authorization. The Meth Confederacy sent a fast attack squadron of 4 ships, highly maneuverable, using a weapons platform that had never failed them in 3 centuries of active service. 2 of those ships were destroyed. 1 was disabled. The last managed to retrieve the crew of the disabled vessel and escaped, and the captain's report was factual and spare, and said only what could be confirmed, which was that the platform had not failed them. It simply had not worked. The Shuri, who were a cautious people, and who had watched all of this from a safe distance before committing anything, sent a single unmanned probe equipped with the most sensitive recording instruments they had. The probe made it inside the Pale Morning through a breach in the outer hull and transmitted for 11 minutes before the signal cut off. What it recorded in those 11 minutes was analyzed extensively and produced a great deal of data about the ship's interior and the state it was in, and the condition of the crew, which was not good, and very little useful information about the entity itself, which appeared in only 4 frames of the recording, and which seemed, in at least 2 of those frames, to be looking directly at the probe. The 4th response came from a species called the Orvari, who were not members of the cooperative but who monitored its emergency channels as a matter of policy. They sent a single vessel without asking anyone's permission and did not explain their reasoning and were gone by the time the council noticed they had come. What they did or did not do inside the exclusion zone that was now informally established around the pale morning was not known, because the Orvari did not share the recording. What was known was that the Orvari vessel departed the area at speed and did not return, and that the Orvari ambassador to the nearest cooperative diplomatic station sent a single message to his counterpart that said, in full, "The situation is as described. We have no recommendation. We are sorry." There was a period after all of this that nobody talked about much in official records, but that Savrin Das would remember in detail for the rest of his life. It was the period of waiting. The battle group's retreat had been broadcast across the emergency channels, and the council had gone quiet in a way that felt less like deliberation and more like a held breath. Ships that were near the coordinates gave the area a wide berth. The pale morning drifted. The signal kept broadcasting, every 4 minutes, the same compressed burst, the same message, the same warning that had already cost so many people their lives. Savrin filed his reports and attended his debriefs and sat in meetings where very serious people said very serious things in very careful voices. And through all of it, he kept thinking about Shan, his team leader, sitting on the deck of the docking bay and staring at nothing. Shan had fought in 3 border conflicts. She had been decorated twice. She was not someone who broke easily. Whatever she had seen in those 11 minutes inside the pale morning, it had broken something in her that he was not certain could be put back. He did not put this in any report. There were no words in the report format for it. The enduring voice was kept in the area as a monitoring vessel, which Savrin thought was either a very good use of his ship or a very poor one, depending on what the monitoring was expected to accomplish. His sensor officer, Veth, continued her attempts to get a clean read on the interior of the pale morning, with the same methodical patience she applied to everything, and continued to fail for the same reason she always had, the scattering effect in the hull composition that refused to let any scan penetrate cleanly. What she did manage, over many days of careful work, was a detailed external survey of the damage to the ship, which told them a great deal about what had already happened and nothing at all about what was happening now. He watched the pale morning through the visual feeds when he could not sleep. It was a habit he could not entirely explain. The ship was not doing anything. It was drifting and rotating, and the lights that worked were on and the lights that did not were off, and nothing changed from 1 hour to the next. But he watched it. He thought about the crew, whose names he had looked up and memorized, all 20 of them. He thought about the thing at the viewport window, the dark shape that had stood still and watched and then moved away. He thought about what it meant that the most capable fighting force the cooperative had assembled could not stop it, and that no one had any idea what to try next. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session. 26 species were represented. They argued for most of one long day. They brought in xenobiologists who studied the visual recordings from the various ships that had attempted contact or combat. They brought in weapons specialists and tactical analysts. By the end of it, they had a set of conclusions that no one in the room was particularly happy about. The entity on the pale morning was of unknown origin. Nothing in any database matched it. It appeared to be singular, meaning they had only observed one, but could not rule out more. It was impervious or nearly impervious to every weapon system that had been used against it, which was a significant list. It appeared to be able to survive in open vacuum without protection. It was extremely dangerous in close quarters and possibly at range as well. And it was, as far as anyone could determine, still on the pale morning, which was still drifting in the same patch of empty space it had been drifting in since the beginning. They needed something they did not have. A junior diplomatic aide from a species called the Lethani, who was young enough to still say things that older attendees would not say out loud, raised her hand during the final consultation and pointed out that there was one member of the Galactic Cooperative that had not yet been consulted. The council fell quiet. The Lethani aide, whose name was Siri Meleva, and who would later become somewhat famous for this moment, said that humanity had joined the cooperative 14 years ago and had not been particularly prominent since, given that they were new and had a great deal to learn about galactic norms and protocols. But she said they had a reputation, not a loud reputation, more like the kind of reputation that traveled quietly and arrived ahead of the people it was about. She said she thought it was worth asking the humans. The room was quiet for another moment. Then the council chair, an elderly Vorath who had been at this work for longer than most species in the room had maintained spaceflight, said that contacting humanity was perhaps premature, given the diplomatic sensitivities involved. Siri Meleva, who was 23 years old and had been working this job for 8 months, and clearly had not yet developed the particular thickness of skin that let experienced diplomats stay quiet when they had something to say, replied that 23 people were dead on the pale morning, 2 Vorath soldiers were dead, and a number of additional people across multiple species were dead from the subsequent response attempts, and that she was not certain diplomatic sensitivity was the primary concern at this moment. The council chair looked at her for a long time. Then he authorized the contact. The human response came back in 4 hours, not from any council or committee or governing body, from a single office. A woman named Director Riza Lund, from an organization called the United Earth Emergency Response Division, which was, the humans explained in a brief attached document, a body that coordinated responses to threats that fell outside normal operational parameters. Director Lund's message was very short. It said, "We are aware of the situation. We have been monitoring since the first cooperative vessels did not return. We will send a team. Please ensure no further approach attempts are made until we have assessed. We will not need assistance." The council read this message several times. The first thing most of them noticed was the phrase "we have been monitoring since the first cooperative vessels did not return," which suggested that the humans had been watching this situation for some time without saying anything. The council sent a follow-up message asking for clarification on that point. Director Lund's clarification arrived in 2 hours. It said that the United Earth Emergency Response Division maintained monitoring protocols on all open distress frequencies in cooperative space as a standard operational procedure. It said that when the first vessels failed to respond after their approach, the division had opened a working file on the situation. It said that they had been waiting to see how the cooperative chose to respond before committing their own resources, because committing their own resources without understanding the shape of the situation first was not how they operated. This clarification was, if anything, more thought-provoking than the original message. The humans had been watching. They had opened a file. They had waited to understand the shape of the situation. These were the behaviors of an organization that had a framework for this kind of thing, and had disciplined itself to use that framework even when the situation was urgent, which this very clearly was. The part that no one could quite get past was still the last line of the original message. "We will not need assistance. Not we do not want assistance," which would have been dismissive but comprehensible. Not "we prefer to work alone," which would have been odd but not alarming. "We will not need it." Present tense, confident, stated as simple fact. The council sent back a message politely noting that the entity had already defeated a Vorath battle group and that the humans might want to reconsider. Director Lund's response came in under an hour this time. It said, "We understand. We are aware of the Vorath engagement and have reviewed all available footage. Our team is already en route. Thank you for your concern." The council representative from the Vorath Collective, who was named Ambassador Seth and who was, by any measure, one of the most composed individuals in that room, sat back in his chair and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, that he would like to request observer status for this response, not to interfere, simply to watch. Director Lund approved the request without apparent hesitation. What came next? Ambassador Seth would spend the rest of his career trying to explain to people who had not been there to witness it. He would write 3 separate papers on the subject. None of them, he would admit in his later years, came close to capturing it. The human ship arrived at the coordinates of the pale morning 17 days after the council contact. It was not what anyone had expected. Most civilizations, when they developed their exploration and defense vessels, arrived at certain common shapes through common needs. Ships needed to carry fuel, so they needed volume. They needed to present as small a profile as possible to incoming fire, so they tended toward narrow silhouettes. They needed to distribute weapons effectively, so those weapons clustered in logical positions. The result, across most of the spacefaring civilizations in the cooperative, was ships that looked roughly similar in their broad strokes. Long, functional, purposeful. The human ship did not look like any of this. It was dark, which was the first thing. Not simply dark in the way that ships were dark because they did not emit light, but dark in a way that seemed almost to absorb the light around it. The hull plating had a texture to it that the Vorath observer vessel could resolve at close range, and that texture was not smooth or regular, but had a quality to it that their sensor officer initially struggled to classify before settling on a word that, in Vorath, roughly translated as deliberately complicated. The human ship was bristling. That was Ambassador Seth's word for it, and he would use it consistently whenever he described this moment. Every surface that he could see had something on it. Arrays of instruments and emitters and sensor clusters and protrusions that did not match any configuration in the Vorath database, packed so densely along the hull that the underlying shape of the vessel was difficult to determine. The ship did not look like it had been designed around a core concept of what a warship should be. It looked like something that had been built to a list, a very long list. It also looked much smaller than the Vorath had expected. Given the scale of the threat they were responding to, and given the confidence of Director Lund's communications, the Vorath observer team had discussed among themselves what kind of vessel the humans would send. The prevailing expectation had been something large, something that would make clear by its presence alone why the humans were not concerned. The human ship was not large. By Vorath military standards it was, in fact, quite small. Compact. About the size of one of their medium frigates, not a capital ship at all. Ambassador Seth was still processing this when the human ship opened a communication channel, and a voice came through that was clearly not from a bridge. Or if it was from a bridge, it was a bridge that had something loud in the background, because behind the voice there was sound. A lot of sound, overlapping and dense in a way that the translator struggled with before settling on the approximate meaning of people preparing. The voice was male. It said in Galactic Standard with an accent that was distinctive and warm, "This is Captain Marcus Webb of the S. Dunmore. We are at the coordinates. We have had a look at the target vessel. We are going in. Observer vessel, please maintain your current distance and under no circumstances approach the pale morning. If this goes wrong, we do not want anyone too close. If it goes right, same." Seth's communications officer looked at him with a question in her expression, and Seth held up one hand in a gesture that meant they would comply and that he was still thinking. He was thinking about the phrase, "if this goes wrong." Most command communications in a situation like this would not include that phrase. They would project certainty, or at minimum confidence, because the morale function of command communications was considered important, and projecting doubt was considered contrary to that function. Webb had said it without any apparent awareness that it might be contrary to anything. He had said it the way someone said a thing that was simply true and that there was no particular reason not to say. Seth found himself, against expectation, somewhat reassured by this. The Dunmore moved toward the pale morning. At 100 meters it stopped, and a panel on its forward section opened, and a smaller craft came out. Not a transfer pod. Something that looked like it had been built for insertion rather than transport, low profile and heavily equipped, with a shape that suggested it was meant to get from one place to another quickly, and then anchor itself so hard that moving it again would be someone else's problem. The insertion craft crossed the 100 meters to the pale morning in a little over 3 minutes, and locked onto the same secondary airlock that the Vorath boarding team had used. And then there was a long silence. Ambassador Seth and his team watched their instruments. The pale morning continued its slow rotation. Nothing on the exterior of the derelict research vessel changed. Nothing came out. Nothing went in again. The Dunmore sat at its 100-meter distance and did not move and did not broadcast anything on any channel the Vorth could monitor. 20 minutes passed, then 30. At the 42-minute mark, every light on the pale morning that still functioned flickered simultaneously. It lasted only a second and then the lights were steady again, but the Vorth sensor officer flagged it and Seth leaned forward in his chair. At 51 minutes, Captain Webb's voice came back over the comm channel. He said, "We have it contained. Working on secure transport now. Should not be much longer." Ambassador Seth keyed his own channel. He said, "Can you confirm the status of the entity?" There was a pause. Then Webb's voice, a little closer to the microphone now, or possibly just a little more focused. "Contained. That is the status. It is alive if you are asking. We are not in the business of killing things we do not understand yet." Seth looked at his first officer, who looked back at him with an expression that mirrored his own, which was the expression of someone who was trying to make a piece of information fit into a framework and finding that the piece was the wrong shape. The entity which had killed the crew of a research vessel, destroyed multiple military ships, and withstood the combined weapons of a Vorth battle group was alive. The humans had it. It had taken them 51 minutes. The secure transport took another hour and a half. In that time, the Dunmore continued to not broadcast anything. The pale morning continued its slow rotation, and Ambassador Seth continued to watch his instruments and wonder what was happening inside that ship. Seth had served in the Vorth fleet for 34 years. He had seen combat. He had seen the aftermath of combat. He had sat in rooms where the news was very bad and watched people absorb it. He thought he had a reasonable sense of the range of things that could happen in space and of how to think about them. He did not have a way to think about this. The Dunmore was smaller than most of the ships that had been lost trying to handle the situation it had apparently just resolved. It had arrived without fanfare or explanation. It had gone to work with the efficiency of something that had done this kind of thing before, and the result was sitting in that ship right now in some kind of containment, alive, 51 minutes after the humans had gone in. Seth thought about the ships the Vorth had committed, the firepower, the training, the centuries of accumulated military doctrine brought to bear on one derelict research vessel drifting in empty space, and the result had been 2 ships destroyed and 3 badly damaged and soldiers dead and the entity still there, still alive, still on the pale morning. Then 1 small human ship, and 51 minutes, and it was over. He opened a channel to his first officer and said he wanted a full recording of everything the Dunmore had done since its arrival, every transmission, every observable action, every reading their instruments had taken. He wanted it catalogued. He wanted it preserved. His first officer asked why. Seth said, "Because I want to understand what we just watched, and I am not certain I will be able to, but I intend to try." When the insertion craft finally came back out through the airlock, it moved differently than it had going in. Slower, more careful. It made the crossing back to the Dunmore at what Seth's pilot estimated was about a quarter of the outbound speed, and it docked with a precision that his crew found notable. Seth opened the channel to the Dunmore. He said, "Captain Webb, can you tell us anything about what occurred inside the vessel?" Webb's response this time was about 4 seconds slower than his previous ones. When it came, there was something in the tone that Seth's translator flagged as contextually complex, and offered a range of possible interpretations that included careful, tired, and pleased, but not without complication. Webb said, "We will put together a full report for the Council. There is a lot to process. The short version is that the entity is physically secured and sedated. We have done preliminary scans, and we have a working theory on its origin that is going to need some follow-up. The Pale Morning's crew did not survive. I am sorry for that. I know that is what everyone wanted to know, and I wanted to say it directly." Seth absorbed this. He said, "The entity. You said you are not in the business of killing things you do not understand. What do you intend to do with it?" There was another pause. Then Webb said, "Study it. Figure out where it came from and what it is and what it needs. Try to communicate if we can. We have had some initial attempts. It is not easy, but it is not nothing." Seth did not know how to respond to this. His translator offered no assistance. He said, "It killed 23 people. Webb said, "Yeah, it did, and we want to understand why. That is not me being naive, Ambassador, if that is what you are thinking. That is me knowing that something that can do what this thing did does not stay in a containment unit forever unless we give it a reason to. The best reason we have ever found is understanding." Ambassador Seth spent a long time looking at the pale morning, still rotating slowly against the stars, its damaged hull reflecting almost nothing, its interior dark and still now where it had not been still before. He said, "How did you contain it? The Vorath battle group could not damage it with direct weapons fire." Webb's voice shifted into something that Seth's translator marked as slightly amused, slightly reluctant, and what it called characteristically human, which was apparently a category the translator had developed independently and found useful. Webb said, "We did not fight it." Seth said, "Then how?" Webb said, "We gave it somewhere else to be." He did not elaborate on this, and when Seth pressed him on it, he said only that the full report would explain the methodology, and that some of it was not yet fully understood even by his own team. He said this in a way that sounded honest rather than evasive, which Seth found disconcerting, because it meant that the humans had done something that worked without being entirely certain why it worked, which was either a sign of extraordinary confidence or a willingness to operate in conditions of deep uncertainty that most species, the Vorath very much included, would have found untenable. The Dunmore departed the coordinates of the pale morning with its cargo secured, its course laid for a facility that Webb described only as appropriate for this kind of study, and its crew apparently intact. The observer vessel from the Vorath followed at a respectful distance until the Dunmore executed its faster-than-light transition and was gone. Ambassador Seth filed his initial report from the bridge, speaking slowly and carefully, trying to construct a narrative that was accurate to what he had observed. He found himself stopping several times and starting over, not because he had made errors, but because each version of the report, when he heard it out loud, sounded like something he had not actually seen and could not quite believe, even though he had been there. He was a careful man and a precise one. He did not use words loosely. But when he reached the part where the insertion craft came back out of the pale morning's airlock moving slowly and carefully, and when he tried to describe the moment, he understood that the entity was inside it, alive and contained. He stopped for almost 2 full minutes before he could continue. He filed 3 drafts before he was satisfied, and even the third draft had a phrase in it that he circled in his notes and came back to several times over the following days, trying to determine whether it was accurate. The phrase appeared to involve no combat engagement. He could not verify this because he had not been inside the ship, but nothing in the sensor data suggested weapons fire. Nothing in the transmission record suggested weapons systems activation. The Dunmore had gone in and come out and the entity was alive, and the only available conclusion was that whatever had happened, fighting had not been the core of it. This was, on reflection, the most difficult sentence he had ever written in a fleet report. The Council received the report and convened a second emergency session, this one closed to all but senior representatives. Siri Melova, the Lethani diplomatic aide who had suggested contacting the humans in the first place, was not invited to this session. She heard about what was discussed in it the same way she heard about most things at this stage of her career, which was through a combination of careful observation, a good memory for names and relationships, and the fact that experienced diplomats, when they were processing something unusual, had a tendency to talk to people in their immediate vicinity, before remembering that those people were junior staff who were still supposed to be learning rather than listening. What she put together from these fragments was that the Council was divided, and the division ran along lines that were both familiar and strange. The familiar part was that some Council members were concerned about the humans and what they represented. Humanity was a new species, geologically speaking. They had been spacefaring for just under 3 centuries, which made them infants by the standards of most civilizations in the room. They had joined the cooperative relatively recently, and had spent most of that time in what the cooperative generally characterized as an adjustment period, learning the protocols and the history and the complex web of relationships and obligations that held the community of spacefaring species together. They were considered, by most assessments, promising but unpredictable, energetic but unformed. The kind of new member you watched carefully not because you were afraid of them, but because new members always required watching. The strange part was the specific nature of the concern, which Siri Meleva had not expected. The council members who were most troubled were not troubled because the humans had failed. They were troubled because the humans had succeeded. In 51 minutes, with a single ship that was notably smaller than the combined force the Vorath had committed, against something that had defeated everything the assembled civilizations of the cooperative had brought to bear, the humans had succeeded. And they had not fought. That was the thing that kept coming up in the fragments Siri collected. They had not fought. The Vorath had brought weapons. The cooperative vessels had brought weapons. Everyone who had approached the pale morning had done so with weapons ready and had been destroyed or driven off or killed. The humans had brought one small ship and had apparently done something that was not fighting, and it had worked. The xenobiologists who had been studying the visual records from the Dunmore, which had been shared voluntarily and in full with the council at Captain Webb's direction, had been trying to reconstruct the methodology from those records for 3 days. They had made some progress. The broad outlines were becoming clearer, though the specific mechanisms were still not fully understood. What the Dunmore's team had done, as best as anyone could determine, was this. They had not tried to kill the entity. They had not tried to drive it away from the pale morning or scare it into leaving or overpower it with superior force. They had instead spent the first part of their operation doing something that the xenobiologists were still arguing about the correct word for, with candidates including mapping, cataloging, and learning. The Dunmore had the most comprehensive sensor suite anyone had ever encountered on a ship its size. Every meter of its hull that was not occupied by something else was occupied by something that was watching or listening or measuring. Before the insertion team went in, the Dunmore had spent those 100 meters and those 42-odd minutes before the lights flickered building a model of the entity, a detailed, high-resolution, multispectral model of what it was, how it moved, what seemed to interest it, what seemed to agitate it, what the space it occupied inside the pale morning looked like from the outside. And when the insertion team went in, they had not gone in as soldiers. They had gone in with that model, and with a set of tools that were not weapons, or not primarily weapons, though weapons were apparently present as a last resort. What they had done with those tools was, according to the xenobiologist's best reconstruction, create conditions that the entity found preferable to the conditions it had been in. How they had known what conditions those were, on the basis of 42 minutes of external observation of a completely unknown life form, was the part that no one could quite figure out. The full technical report from the Dunmore science team, when it arrived, ran to several hundred pages and was dense enough that it required specialist reviewers in multiple fields to parse. Siri Meleva, who was not a specialist in any of those fields but who had a strong instinct for what mattered and a willingness to read things that were not technically her job, got hold of a copy through channels she would decline to specify and spent 2 nights reading it. The part that stayed with her was not the methodology, which was complex and fascinating. It was a section near the end, in a chapter written by the Dunmore's chief science officer, a woman whose name appeared on the document as Dr. Yale Brandt, who had apparently led the on-board research team during the operation. Dr. Brandt wrote, in the plain and somewhat blunt style that Siri was coming to associate with human professional writing, that the team's approach had been informed by a set of principles developed over several centuries of human contact with unfamiliar species, both native to Earth and encountered elsewhere. She wrote that these principles were not universally agreed upon within human scientific and military communities, but that they had been the basis of this operation's planning and execution, and that the results spoke to their validity. The core principle, Dr. Brandt wrote, was this: an entity that is experiencing fear, pain, or disorientation will behave in ways that are dangerous. An entity that is experiencing safety, calm, and understanding will, in the vast majority of cases, behave differently. This principle sounds simple, and it is. We have found that it is also frequently overlooked in favor of approaches that prioritize force, because force is faster and requires less knowledge of the subject. We chose not to use force here because we did not have sufficient knowledge to use it effectively, and because we have learned, many times and at significant cost, that insufficient knowledge combined with force produces outcomes that are worse than neither. This was, Siri thought, either the most obvious thing she had ever read or the most profound, and she spent a long time trying to decide which. She eventually concluded that it was both, and that the gap between knowing something and acting on it was larger than most people recognized. The cooperative had known, in a general sense, that unknown creatures could be dangerous. It had not known how to close the gap between that knowledge and doing something useful with it. The humans apparently had. The months that followed the pale morning incident were strange and interesting in the way that things are strange and interesting when they have changed the shape of a conversation without anyone quite agreeing on how. The entity was at a human facility, undergoing study. Updates came through the council at irregular intervals, written in the same plain, somewhat blunt style as Dr. Brandt's report, and they described a process that was slow and careful, and apparently going somewhere. The entity had not been harmed. The entity had begun to respond to certain stimuli in ways that suggested cautiously that communication might eventually be possible. The entity appeared to have needs that could be met without causing harm to anyone. The humans were working on meeting them. Nobody at the council was entirely sure what to do with this information. Some members found it reassuring. Some found it troubling. Some found it both at different times of day. Vorath representatives, who had lost 2 soldiers and taken significant ship casualties, were in ongoing internal discussions about how to categorize what had happened. Their after-action process was thorough and their conclusions were provisional, but the word that appeared most often in their internal discussions, as Seth would later note, was not danger or threat or warning. The word that appeared most often was unfamiliar. The humans were not familiar. They did not operate by familiar frameworks. They did not make familiar decisions. This was not the same as saying they were dangerous, though it was also not the same as saying they were not. It was, Seth wrote in one of his papers, simply new. Captain Marcus Webb gave a presentation to the council about 4 months after the incident. He was a medium-height man in his early 50s, with the look of someone who had spent a lot of time in confined spaces and had made a form of peace with that. He wore the uniform of the United Earth Fleet, but wore it the way someone wore a familiar garment rather than a formal one. He answered questions directly and without visible impatience, even the questions that were more pointed than polite. The session opened with a detailed technical walkthrough. Webb presented the Dunmore sensor data from the approach, the 42 minutes of observation, the insertion team's entry, and everything that followed in the sequence that it had happened. He was clear and precise, and he took questions at each stage, which was not standard council presentation protocol but which he had apparently been told was acceptable, and which turned out to produce better questions than the usual end-of-session format. The first 42 minutes, Webb explained, had been the most important part of the operation. He walked through what the Dunmore sensor arrays had been doing during that time, which was a great deal. He described the model they had built. He described what they had learned from it and what remained uncertain, and how they had weighted those uncertainties in their planning. He described the decision point, the moment when the team had enough information to move from observation to action, and what had made them decide they had reached it. When he got to the part about what had happened inside the pale morning, he paused and said, "I am going to be careful here, because some of what I am about to describe is based on real-time team reports and my own subsequent review of the recordings, and there are still aspects that are not fully understood even by the people who were there. I want to be accurate and I also want to be honest about the limits of that accuracy. The room was very quiet. Webb said the entity was in the forward cargo section when the team entered. It was aware of them immediately. The first several minutes were essentially a standoff, and in a standoff the thing that matters most is who blinks, and the human word for what the team did is that they did not blink. They held position. They continued their observation. They ran the instruments. And they waited for the entity to make a move that told them something useful. He paused. He said, "It moved toward them." And the team held. That is the part that is hardest to explain. Knowing that something is not immediately going to kill you when it is moving toward you, in conditions where the previous experience of every other species that had encountered it suggested it very much was going to kill you, requires a particular kind of confidence. Not certainty, confidence. The distinction matters. One of the Lethani representatives asked him what the distinction was. Webb said, "Certainty is knowing the outcome. Confidence is trusting the reasoning." The team did not know what the entity was going to do. They trusted the model. That is not the same thing. When he got to the part about the insertion team going in without primary weapons forward, there was a pause in the room that was different from the other pauses. One of the Vorath representatives asked him to clarify what he meant by that. Webb said the team had weapons but had not gone in with them in an active forward posture. They had gone in with the observation tools in hand and the weapons accessible but not raised. The Vorath representative asked why. Webb said, "Because going in with weapons forward changes what you are, from the perspective of anything inside. We wanted to go in as observers first and responders second. The entity had already shown it could handle weapons. We were not bringing anything it could not deal with. What we were trying to bring was something it had not encountered yet, which was a group of beings who were not immediately trying to kill it." The room was quiet for a moment. One of the Lethani representatives, an older woman who had been in her seat for many years and who spoke rarely but was listened to carefully when she did, said, "You were betting your team's lives on the assumption that the entity would distinguish between the two." Webb said, "We were betting our team's lives on the evidence we had gathered in 42 minutes of observation which suggested that it could distinguish." Yes, the Lethani representative said, "That is a significant degree of trust to place in 42 minutes of data." Webb said, "It is. We had other factors, the historical framework, the principle set, the specific behavioral indicators we had cataloged. But yes. At the end of it, there was a point where we had done the preparation we could do and we had to make a decision. We made it." One of the Vorath representatives asked him near the end how his team had known what to do, not the methodology which Webb had already walked through in considerable detail. How had they known at the moment of decision that it would work, that they should trust it? Webb considered this for a moment. He said, "We did not know. That is not the kind of thing you know in advance. You make the best decision you can with the information you have and you trust the reasoning behind it and you go." The representative asked, "And if it had not worked?" Webb said, "Then we would have tried something else, and if that did not work we would try something else after that." The representative said, "And if nothing worked?" Webb said, "Then we would have known something important about this kind of entity that we did not know before. That is still worth something." The room was quiet. Ambassador Seth, who was not scheduled to speak and who had been sitting quietly through the presentation with the particular stillness of someone who was listening to every word, raised his hand. He said, "Captain Webb, you said you are not in the business of killing things you do not understand. This is a principle." Webb said, "Yeah." Seth said, "How long has it been a principle?" Webb said, "Formally, about 60 years. We have an institute for it. Developed after a few situations where we did not follow it and regretted that." Seth said, "What situations?" Webb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Most of them are in our historical record if you want to look. The short version is that we killed things we did not understand and found out later that we were wrong about them in ways that mattered. Not every time, but enough times that we built an institution around trying not to repeat it." Seth said, "Your species has a history of this kind of error." Webb said, "Every species does. We just got formal about learning from it earlier than some." This was, by the accounts of everyone present, the quietest moment in the entire session. not because the answer was surprising exactly, but because it was the kind of honesty that council sessions did not usually produce, and because it reframed something that had been sitting in the room since the beginning of the session in a way that made it easier to see clearly. The humans had done what they did at the pale morning not because they were uniquely wise or unusually powerful. They had done it because they had made enough mistakes to know what not to do, and had done the work of turning that knowledge into something they could act on. This was different from what the council had been expecting. They had been expecting either a power they could not match or a secret they could not access. What they had found instead was something simpler and in some ways more difficult: experience. Documented, institutionalized, hard-won experience. Siri Meleva, sitting in the back of the room where junior staff were permitted to observe when the session was open, wrote a single sentence in her notes. It said, "They have been doing this longer than we think." She underlined it. Then she put the pen down and listened to the rest of the session. The weeks after Webb's presentation brought several developments. 3 species formally requested that humans be included in their standard response planning frameworks. The Vorath Collective, who were more deliberate about this kind of decision than most, submitted a formal inquiry asking whether joint training exercises were something the United Earth Fleet would consider. The answer came back from Director Lund's office in less time than most people expected. It said yes. It listed available personnel and schedules with a specificity that suggested the question had been anticipated. The entity from the pale morning, who had no name in any language and was referred to in most council documents simply as the subject, began producing what the researchers described as consistent responses to communication attempts. These were not language, not yet. But they were responses, patterns that replied to patterns. The researchers were cautious about their language, careful not to claim more than they had evidence for, but Dr. Brandt's update to the council noted that they were operating on the working assumption that they were dealing with intelligence until proven otherwise, and that this assumption was, so far, being supported rather than contradicted. She also noted that the entity appeared to have been in pain when the pale morning had collided with it. The collision with the uncharted object that the ship's original distress signal had reported had been the ship hitting the entity, which had been in the object's orbital path and had not been moving. They could not yet determine whether the entity had been stranded there or had been there for reasons of its own. What they could determine, based on the biometric data they now had, was that the entity had been injured and had been reacting to that injury when the crew of the pale morning had encountered it. This information arrived at the council in the same plain, factual style as everything else from the Dunmore's team, and it sat in the room for a moment before anyone spoke. Then the Vorath representative, who was not Ambassador Seth today but his deputy, a precise and composed woman named Vara, said, "It was defending itself." And then there was a long silence because the sentence was true and the sentence changed something, and everyone in the room understood both things simultaneously. The pale morning's crew had died, the Vorath soldiers had died, the crews of the cooperative ships had died. And somewhere behind all of that was a creature that had been hurt and afraid in the dark, that had not known what these strange vessels were, or what the beings inside them wanted, that had done what injured and afraid creatures do, which was fight, and that was now in a room somewhere on a human facility, responding to patterns with patterns, while the people who had come to find it worked carefully and slowly towards something that might eventually be called understanding. Siri Meleva had a second sentence in her notes now, written below the first. It said, "They did not come to win, they came to learn." She sat with this for a moment looking at it. Then she added a third line. It said, "This is the difference. The council did not reach a consensus on the humans at that session or the one after it. What happened instead was slower and quieter and more like what always happened when something new arrived in a community of old institutions. People talked. People argued. People revised their positions incrementally and then revised them again. Papers got written. The papers got read and debated and sometimes refuted. The record built up. What gradually became clear, not as an official finding but as something that most people in the relevant conversations agreed on when they were being direct, was that the humans were not what they had seemed to be 14 years ago when they joined the cooperative, and that the picture most of the cooperative had formed of them in those 14 years had been missing something important. The cooperative had seen a young species, enthusiastic, a little rough around the edges. Good intentions but limited track record. The kind of member you were polite to and mentored and did not, if you were being honest, think too much about in terms of what they might contribute. What the pale morning incident had made visible was that the picture was incomplete. The humans had been in space for just under 3 centuries, yes, but 3 centuries was not nothing. 3 centuries was long enough to make serious mistakes, long enough to learn from them, long enough to build institutions around that learning and staff those institutions with people who had inherited the accumulated knowledge of the generations before them, refined it, added to it, and were now operating from a body of practical experience that did not show up in the age of their civilization in the way that anyone outside them would automatically think to look for. The Vorath had been doing this for epochs. The cooperative's oldest members had been spacefaring for longer than most species had been writing, but old did not always mean experienced in the right ways. Old could mean entrenched. Old could mean committed to methodologies that worked for the situations you had already encountered, and less agile about the situations you had not. The humans had been doing this for 3 centuries, and they had made enough mistakes in those 3 centuries that they had built entire institutions around not repeating them. And those institutions were staffed by people like Dr. Yale Brandt and Captain Marcus Webb, who operated from the principles those institutions embodied, and who had taken one look at the pale morning situation and understood, in the way that you understand things when you have context for them, exactly what kind of problem it was and exactly what kind of approach it required. This was not, as Siri Meleva wrote in a paper she submitted to the Lethani Diplomatic Journal 2 years after the incident, because the humans were uniquely gifted or specially positioned or operating from capabilities that no other species could develop. It was because they had done the work. The paper was titled simply, On Preparation. It made the argument that the most important thing the pale morning incident had revealed was not about humans specifically, but about what happened when a civilization took its failures seriously enough to learn from them systematically. That this was available to any civilization. That the cooperative, as a whole, did it imperfectly and inconsistently. That this was worth examining. She sent a copy to Ambassador Seth, who had retired from active service but maintained a correspondence with people he found worth talking to. He wrote back within a week. His response was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph said she was right about the preparation. The second paragraph said that the part she had not addressed in the paper, and that he thought was worth a follow-up, was the question of what you were prepared for. Because the humans had not been prepared for the specific entity on the pale morning, no one had been. What they had been prepared for was uncertainty itself. Not this uncertainty, not this specific unknown, but the experience of encountering something they did not understand and having to act in that condition. They had practiced operating in uncertainty long enough that uncertainty, in a particular sense, had become familiar. And familiar things, however strange their contents, were navigable in ways that truly unfamiliar things were not. The third paragraph said he was glad she had written the paper, and that if she was interested in continuing to think about these questions, he knew some people who were working on related problems from the Vorath side, and that introductions could be arranged. Siri Meleva accepted the introductions. Several years later, she was part of a joint working group that included humans, Vorath, and 3 other species, studying the question of how the cooperative as a whole could do better at the thing the humans had done well at the pale morning. The working group produced a set of recommendations. Some of the recommendations were adopted, some were not. The ones that were not tended to be the ones that required the most change in how existing institutions thought about themselves, which was not a surprise to anyone on the working group, because this was how it always went. But some of the recommendations were adopted, and the ones that were adopted made a difference, in the specific and measurable way that careful preparation makes a difference when the thing you prepared for eventually arrives. Captain Marcus Webb, who had moved on to other assignments, and then eventually to a teaching role at the United Earth Fleet Academy, heard about the working group's results through channels he maintained for exactly that purpose. He sent a brief note of congratulations that was professional and warm, and did not say anything that could be construed as self-congratulatory, because that was not how he operated. Dr. Yale Brandt, who was still working in the field and who had published 3 papers in the years since the pale morning incident that were widely read across multiple species, sent a longer response. It included a question about one of the working group's specific recommendations and a suggestion for a follow-up study that she thought would strengthen the evidence base. Siri Melova responded to this one personally and at length, and a collaboration resulted from it, and that collaboration produced a body of work that neither of them could have produced alone. This was, though nobody made a ceremony of it, what the humans had brought to the cooperative, not just the specific capability they had demonstrated at the pale morning, something longer lasting. The entity that had been on the pale morning was still being studied, many years later. Progress was slow, as progress on genuinely hard problems always was, but it was progress, and the entity was alive and the researchers were learning, and somewhere in the accumulation of that slow and careful work was the beginning of something that did not yet have a name. Nobody knew what the entity would turn out to be. Nobody knew what it would mean in the end that it had been found, but someone was finding out. Carefully, without hurry. With the particular patience that comes not from the absence of urgency, but from the understanding that some things cannot be rushed without being ruined, and that knowing which things those are is itself a skill, hard one, worth protecting. Savrin Das, who had been the first to see the entity at the viewport window, retired from service 2 years after the pale morning incident. He received his honors quietly and moved to a small home on the Vorith homeworld's southern continent where the weather was mild, and the silence was the kind of silence that felt earned rather than empty. He followed the council updates when they came. He read Dr. Brandt's papers, slowly and more than once, with a kind of attention that he had previously reserved for tactical documents. He thought about Shan, who had recovered partially over time, and who had eventually gone back to service in a different capacity. He thought about the 2 soldiers who had not come back. He thought about them often. He was not certain what he felt about the humans. He was not certain, after several years of thinking about it, that his feelings about them were the right frame for understanding what they represented. They were not, as far as he could tell, trying to be impressive. They were not performing for anyone. They had come to the pale morning because the problem was there and they had tools for it, and they had done what they came to do and they had filed their reports and moved on. That, in the end, was the thing he found himself returning to most. Not the capability, not the methodology, the complete absence of performance. The humans had done something that no one else could do, and they had done it in a way that seemed, from everything he could observe, entirely natural to them. Not special, not exceptional, just the way they operated. He had been in the fleet long enough to know that the gap between knowing what to do and being the kind of person for whom it came naturally was the largest gap there was. The Vorith trained for decades to close that gap on specific problems. The humans appeared to have closed it, imperfectly but genuinely, on a class of problem that no one else had even clearly defined yet. This was either very good news or something more complicated. He thought on balance that it was both. Outside the facility where the work was happening, the stars were the same as they had always been. The space between them was the same. The distances were the same. But something had moved. Not far. Not yet. Just enough to mean that the next time something unknown came out of that space, the beings who encountered it would know a little more than they had known before. They would have a little more to draw on. They would be in the small and incremental and enormously important way that preparation works, a little more ready. That was all. That was everything.